He raised his glass at Thanksgiving dinner, smiling that smug half-smile I'd seen 1,000 times before. His voice carried across the entire table as he spoke. At least the rest of my kids made something of themselves. The words hit me like a physical blow. My stomach turned cold as nervous laughter rippled around the table. I just told everyone I was leaving business school to start my own venture. My father, Vincent Caldwell, crushed that dream with one casual sentence. My older brother Thomas smirked into his wine glass. My sister Natalie shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Mom stared at her plate, silent as always. When Dad added, "She'll never amount to anything," something inside me snapped. That was the last Thanksgiving dinner I ever attended. The chandelier light suddenly felt too bright. The turkey on my plate looked like cardboard. I excused myself quietly, climbed the stairs to my childhood bedroom, and started packing. My hands shook as I folded clothes into my duffel bag. I packed everything I could carry that night, ignoring my mother's whispered plea to let him cool off when she appeared at my doorway. Her eyes were red, but she didn't defend me. She never did. No, I thought as I zipped my bag. This time I was done cooling off. I'd spent 22 years cooling off, swallowing my words, accepting his judgments. Not anymore. I walked down those stairs for the last time with $1,200 in my bank account and a head full of ideas he'd called nonsense. The November air bit at my skin as I loaded my car. Through the window, I could see the family still gathered around the table. Dad was laughing now, probably relieved I'd left. I sat in my driver's seat for a moment, engine running, hands gripping the steering wheel. "You'll regret underestimating me," I whispered into the darkness. Then I drove away from the only home I'd ever known, with no plan except to prove him wrong. I crashed on my college friend Brian's couch for the first month. He lived in a cramped studio apartment that smelled like instant ramen and old coffee. I tried launching my first product that December, an eco-supply logistics app I designed in my final semester. I spent every dollar I had on a basic prototype and cheap marketing. 2 months later, I was completely broke. The app failed because I'd rushed it, because I didn't understand the market, because I was naive and desperate. I ended up sleeping in Brian's spare room, which was really just a closet with a mattress. Dad's voice haunted me during those dark winter nights. "You'll come crawling back." But instead of crawling back home, I started studying everything I could find. Business models, pitch strategies, growth systems, failure case studies. The library became my office. Failure became my tuition, and I was a dedicated student. I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. One cold morning in March, I was freelancing as a website designer at a local cafe to pay Brian rent. The coffee shop hummed with conversation and espresso machine sounds. I overheard 2 small business owners at the next table complaining loudly about inventory problems. Their bakery was losing money because they couldn't track supplies properly. I leaned over and offered to help, expecting them to ignore me. They looked at me skeptically, this broke kid in a worn jacket. Until I showed them how to fix their entire system overnight using a simple spreadsheet and free software. They stared at the laptop screen in amazement. By the next week, they paid me $800. It wasn't much, but it felt like a fortune. For the first time since that Thanksgiving dinner, I thought maybe I wasn't worthless after all. Maybe Dad had been wrong. That payment was more than money. It was validation, proof that my ideas had value even if my father couldn't see it. Word spread slowly through the local business community. One satisfied client told another, who told another. Soon I had a trickle of clients, local bakeries, print shops, small manufacturers who needed help with operations. No investors backing me, no fancy office, no media attention. Just me, my laptop, and results that spoke for themselves. I charged modest fees and delivered real solutions. Every invoice I sent was another brick in the wall between who I was and who Dad said I'd never be. I moved into my own tiny apartment that summer. It was barely bigger than Brian's closet, but it was mine. The walls were thin and the heating barely worked, but I'd never felt more proud. Then one email changed everything that September. "Would you consult for a regional distribution firm?" The company was 3 times bigger than any client I'd worked with before. My hands trembled as I typed my response. This was the opportunity I'd been working toward. The distribution company was struggling badly, bleeding money from inefficient routes and outdated systems. The owner, an older man named Frank, was desperate but skeptical of my age. I was only 23. But I spent 3 weeks analyzing every aspect of their operation. I found waste everywhere, redundant routes, overstaffed warehouses, suppliers charging double the market rate. Within 6 months, I'd cut their costs by 40% and increased their delivery speed. Frank was amazed. He offered me a full-time position with a generous salary. I declined politely. Instead, I negotiated something better, a small equity stake in the company. He agreed, probably thinking it wouldn't amount to much. But I'd learned something important from my father, even if he'd never meant to teach me. Control means everything. Ownership means everything. I'd rather own a small piece of something valuable than collect a salary from someone else's dream. That equity stake became the foundation of everything that followed. By the time I turned 27, I had 3 equity stakes in different companies and a small but fiercely loyal team. We officially named the firm Northline Consulting that spring. My team consisted of 4 people I'd met through various projects, all brilliant, all hungry to prove themselves. While other consultants chased headlines and attention, we chased efficiency. We specialized in saving family businesses from themselves, fixing the operational problems that owners were too proud or too close to see. The irony wasn't lost on me. Each contract we signed was a silent message to my father. Look what your failure built. Look what the daughter you dismissed created. I never posted on social media about our success. I never sent articles to my family. I wanted my success to speak for itself, quietly and undeniably. By that winter, Northline had saved 17 businesses from bankruptcy. Our reputation grew through whispered recommendations, the most powerful kind of marketing. We were becoming known as the firm that fixed impossible situations. I hadn't spoken to my father in nearly 10 years. Mom and I texted occasionally, brief exchanges about holidays and health. She never mentioned Dad, and I never asked. Then one Tuesday afternoon, her message appeared on my phone. Your father's company is in trouble. I stared at those 6 words for a long moment. Caldwell Manufacturing had been Dad's pride for 30 years. He'd built it from nothing, or so he always claimed. Apparently, he'd lost 2 major clients and owed substantial back taxes. Mom said he'd told everyone he was restructuring, putting on a brave face. But I knew better. I'd seen enough struggling companies to recognize the signs. He was drowning, and his pride wouldn't let him admit it. I didn't respond to Mom's text immediately. Part of me felt satisfaction at his downfall. Another part, smaller but persistent, felt something else. Not quite sympathy, but curiosity. What would the great Vincent Caldwell do when everything crumbled? Would he finally understand what he'd done to me? 3 weeks later, my associate forwarded a pitch deck. Mid-sized manufacturing company seeking capital investment. Standard procedure. I reviewed these requests weekly. But when I opened the file, the company name hit me like a thunderclap. Caldwell Manufacturing. My father's company. The deck was poorly put together, desperate and rushed. The financials were worse than I'd imagined. My team gathered around the conference table, discussing whether this fit our portfolio. They had no idea about my connection to the company. They saw only another struggling manufacturer. I kept my face neutral, professional. My hands remained steady as I flipped through pages of my father's failure. Schedule a meeting, I said calmly. My team nodded and started making arrangements. None of them noticed how tightly I gripped my pen under the table. This was it. 10 years of work had led to this exact moment. I would walk into my father's world as the investor he desperately needed. And he wouldn't even recognize me. I walked into the glass conference room under my company name, Northline Holdings. I dressed carefully that morning. A charcoal suit and minimal jewelry. Professional, powerful, forgettable. Dad sat at the head of the table with his attorney and CFO. He looked older, grayer, with new lines around his eyes. He didn't recognize me at first. Why would he? The last time he'd seen me, I was a defeated college dropout fleeing his Thanksgiving table. Now I was a composed investor reviewing his desperate pitch. He shook my hand, his grip still firm and commanding. Thank you for considering us, he said. Oblivious. Completely oblivious. For once, I didn't crave his approval or acknowledgement. I owned this room, the room he thought I'd never be qualified to stand in. I took my seat across from him and opened my notebook. Walk me through your current situation, I said. My voice was steady, businesslike. He began explaining, making excuses, blaming market conditions and bad luck. I listened without interrupting, taking notes, watching him squirm. I spent the next 2 hours reviewing his financials in detail. The numbers told a clear story. Wasteful spending on unnecessary equipment. Inflated invoices from supplier friends who were overcharging him. Outdated manufacturing processes that competitors had modernized years ago. He wasn't running a business anymore. He was preserving an ego, maintaining an image of success while the foundation rotted underneath. When I said, "These books are a mess," he bristled immediately. That same flash of anger I'd seen 10 years ago at Thanksgiving flickered across his face. His jaw tightened. His CFO shifted uncomfortably. But now everything was different. Now I was the one holding the pen, controlling the meeting, making the decisions. He had to sit there and take my criticism because he needed what I had. Money. Expertise. A lifeline. We can fix this, I continued, but it will require significant changes. He nodded stiffly, saying nothing. Pride and desperation wore visibly on his face. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The board meeting happened 2 weeks later. Dad's board of directors had grown tired of his arrogance and mismanagement. Several had threatened to resign. They needed fresh capital and someone who could actually deliver results, not just promises. I presented a detailed restructuring plan. Cut redundant positions. Renegotiate all supplier contracts. Modernize the production line. Bring in temporary management consultants. It was aggressive but necessary. The board asked tough questions. I answered every one confidently, backed by data and case studies from our previous successes. When the vote came, it passed by a narrow margin. Northline Holdings would acquire 60% of Caldwell Manufacturing shares. Dad would remain as founder but lose operational control. He stormed out of the room the moment the vote concluded, his face red with humiliation. I didn't smile, not yet. This wasn't the victory I'd imagined. It felt hollow somehow, necessary but unsatisfying. I gathered my papers slowly, watching through the window as Dad paced angrily in the parking lot. My mother called that night while I was reviewing contracts. Her voice was strained, worried. "Your father's furious," she said. "He says some young woman humiliated him in front of his own board." I bit my lip hard, caught between wanting to laugh and wanting to cry. If only she knew. If only she understood that the young woman was her own daughter, the one they'd written off a decade ago. "What happened?" I asked, playing ignorant. Mom explained the meeting from Dad's perspective. How this aggressive investor had torn apart his company. How she'd taken control. How she dismissed his objections coldly. "He's not himself," Mom continued. "He barely ate dinner. Just sat in his office staring at papers." Part of me felt vindicated. Another part felt guilty for not telling her the truth. But I wasn't ready yet. The reveal had to happen at the right moment, when it would mean the most. "I'm sure it'll work out," I said vaguely. We said goodbye, and I sat in silence, thinking about what came next. I didn't expose myself immediately. Instead, I began quietly restructuring his company. I brought in my team to retrain the staff on modern processes. We renegotiated every supplier contract, cutting costs by 30%. We digitized their entire inventory system, something Dad had resisted for years. Every week, I implemented new changes. Every week, Dad became more irrelevant to his own company's operations. He'd show up to meetings, but decisions were made without him. His opinions were noted and then ignored. I wanted him to feel exactly what I'd felt growing up. Dismissed. Invisible. Unimportant. It sounds cruel written out like this. Maybe it was cruel. But I couldn't stop. Each small victory over his pride felt like justice for that 22-year-old girl who'd left his house in tears. The employees responded well to the changes. Morale actually improved without Dad's constant criticism and micromanaging. Production increased. Costs dropped. The company started stabilizing. Everything I touched improved, just like I'd known it would. Mom called again a month later, her voice desperate now. "Please come home," she begged. "Your father's not himself. He barely sleeps. Just talks about that woman ruining everything. She paused. I know you're busy with your work, but could you just come talk to him? Maybe help him see reason? I almost said no. Almost. But curiosity is a dangerous thing. And I wanted to see him, wanted to witness firsthand what defeat looked like on Vincent Caldwell's face. I'll come this weekend, I agreed. Mom sounded relieved. Grateful. She had no idea what she'd just invited into her home. That Saturday, I drove back to the house I'd left 10 years ago. The neighborhood looked exactly the same. Our old colonial sat on its perfect lawn, the same mailbox, the same front door. My hands shook slightly as I parked. This was different from the board meeting. This was personal. This was family. I sat in my car for 5 minutes, breathing deeply, preparing myself. Then I walked up to the door and rang the bell. Mom opened the door, her face lighting up. She hugged me tightly. Longer than usual. You look so professional, she said, taking in my appearance. So successful. If only she knew how successful. She led me to the living room where Dad sat in his leather chair, staring at nothing. The room felt heavy with silence and old tension. He didn't look up when I walked in, didn't acknowledge my presence. Mom hovered nervously, clearly hoping for some kind of reconciliation. She started talking about the company, about the investor causing problems. That Northline woman is destroying everything your father built, she said. Dad finally spoke, his voice bitter. She's ruthless. Cold. Doesn't understand what this company means. I leaned forward slightly, my heart pounding. Maybe she's just doing her job. My voice was quiet but clear. He froze. Something in my tone made him finally look up. Really look. His eyes met mine, and I watched recognition slowly dawn on his face. You, he whispered. Yes, I said. The daughter who'd never amount to anything. Mom gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she looked between Dad and me, understanding flooding her face. Riley? She whispered. That's you? You're the investor. I nodded, keeping my eyes on Dad. His face had gone pale, all the anger draining away into shock. He stared at me as if seeing a ghost, unable to form words. You left 10 years ago, Mom said, her voice breaking. You just disappeared. We thought. You thought I'd failed, I finished for her. You thought I'd crawled back to some dead-end job, proving Dad right. Neither of them denied it. The silence stretched between us, heavy with a decade of assumptions and disappointments. How? Dad finally managed. His voice sounded smaller than I'd ever heard it. I smiled without warmth. I built something. Quietly. While you forgot I existed. I stood up, preparing to leave. The restructuring continues Monday. You'll receive an updated timeline. Then I walked out of my childhood home for the second time, leaving them both sitting in stunned silence. For the next week, Dad refused to come to work. His pride was a fortress, and I'd breached the walls. He couldn't face his employees knowing his daughter, the failure, had taken control. But the board needed results, not emotions. And I delivered. Each day brought new improvements. Each headline praised Northline's turnaround of Caldwell Manufacturing. Industry publications called me a rising star in business consulting. None of them knew the personal history behind the deal. Dad's legend was crumbling with each article. The great Vincent Caldwell saved by his unknown daughter. The irony was delicious. My team noticed my satisfaction but didn't ask questions. They assumed I was just pleased with another successful project. On Friday, he showed up at my temporary office in his building, unannounced. I looked up from my laptop to find him standing in my doorway. He looked terrible, like he hadn't slept in days. You've made your point, he said, his voice trembling slightly. Can we talk? Really talk? I considered saying no. Instead, I pulled out a file folder. Senior advisor. Unpaid. Optional attendance. Let him feel invisible for once. He tried, I'll give him that. For the next week, Dad showed up early and stayed late. He asked questions instead of giving orders. He attended meetings quietly, taking notes. I watched him struggle with humility, something completely foreign to his nature. Part of me started to soften. He was trying to understand what I'd built, trying to see the daughter he'd overlooked. Maybe this could be a turning point. Maybe we could rebuild something. Then I caught him trying to override one of my directives. He'd gone directly to the production manager, attempting to cancel a process change I'd implemented, using his founder status to undermine my authority. Old habits die hard. When I confronted him, he defended himself. That process is inefficient. I've been doing this for 30 years. And I've been fixing your mistakes for 6 months, I replied. That night, I revoked his building access clearance. He could attend scheduled meetings only, nothing else. Mom called, crying, begging me to reconsider. I hung up without responding. Some lessons need to be learned the hard way. His health started declining after that. The stress, the humiliation, the loss of control. It crushed him in ways I hadn't anticipated. Mom called regularly now, her voice always worried. He's barely eating. He just sits in his home office, staring at old company photos. One evening she called in tears. He's losing everything that mattered to him. His company, his reputation, his pride. I sat in my apartment, phone pressed to my ear, torn between triumph and grief. This was what I'd wanted, wasn't it? For him to feel what I'd felt. To understand what his words had done to me. But revenge never feels as clean as you imagine it. It's messy and complicated, mixed with guilt and regret. Maybe he should have thought about that 10 years ago, I said quietly. But the words felt hollow. Mom's crying intensified. Please, Riley. He's your father. He stopped being my father when he told everyone I'd never amount to anything. I hung up and sat in darkness, wondering if I'd gone too far. Wondering if victory was supposed to feel this empty. I visited him the following Saturday. Not at his request, but because I needed to see this through properly. I drove to Caldwell Manufacturing, using my access card to enter the building. The place was empty on weekends. I found him in his old office, the one he'd occupied for 3 decades before I'd moved him to a smaller space. He sat at his old desk, which was now just storage for archived files. He looked up when I entered, surprised. His eyes were red, his face drawn. I'm not here to destroy you, I said quietly, standing in the doorway. I never was. He looked at me like he didn't believe that. Maybe he was right not to. I'm here to save what's left of this company, I continued. Because despite everything, it employs 60 people who don't deserve to lose their jobs because of your pride. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, why? Because I still remember what it felt like, I said, to want someone to believe in me. His face crumbled then. Not dramatically, but quietly, the way strong men break when they've held too much for too long. I was wrong, he whispered. I know. The final transfer of ownership happened in a lawyer's office 2 weeks later. Dad sat across from me, his attorney beside him. The papers were spread across the mahogany table, detailing the complete handover of control. Everything he'd built now belonged to me. His hands shook as he picked up the pen. I watched those familiar hands, the ones that used to seem so strong and certain. Now they trembled with age and defeat. When the pen touched paper, I realized this was more than a business contract. This was the surrender of everything he defined himself by. His life's work. His legacy. His pride. He signed each page slowly, methodically. When the last signature was complete, he set the pen down and looked at me. I taught you something at least, he said. His voice was barely audible. I raised an eyebrow, waiting. How not to run a business, he continued. The next board meeting was my moment to address everyone formally. The room was full, all the board members, senior staff, key investors. They knew a major announcement was coming. I stood at the head of the table, the same spot where Dad used to stand. This company's future starts today, I began. We've spent 6 months stabilizing operations and rebuilding financial health. That foundation is solid now. People nodded, pleased with the progress. Then I continued, there's something you should all know about why I took such a personal interest in this company. The room went silent, everyone leaning forward. I'm not just the majority investor in Caldwell Manufacturing, I paused, letting the moment build. I'm also Vincent Caldwell's daughter. The silence that followed was absolute. Faces registered shock, confusion, disbelief. Some board members turned to look at Dad, who sat in the back corner. He lowered his gaze to the table. Everything I've done has been to save this company, I continued. To preserve what's valuable and fix what's broken. The Caldwell name will survive. Just under new leadership. The empire my father built now belonged to the daughter he dismissed. The symmetry was almost poetic. Months passed. Caldwell Manufacturing thrived under our restructuring. Revenue increased by 40%. We hired back employees who'd been laid off. Industry awards came in. I kept Dad on as an honorary consultant, mostly for Mom's sake. She'd been through enough. He attended occasional meetings, usually sitting quietly in the corner, watching. No longer the center of attention, but still present. One afternoon in late autumn, I was reviewing quarterly reports when he appeared at my office door. "Do you have a minute?" he asked. His voice was different now. Humble. I nodded, and he sat across from my desk. We'd barely spoken since the ownership transfer. He studied the photos on my wall, pictures of my team, our successful projects, the companies we'd saved. "I was wrong about you," he whispered finally. The words I'd waited 10 years to hear. I smiled softly, but there was no triumph in it. Just understanding. "No, Dad," I said. "You weren't wrong." He looked up, confused. "You were just early," I continued. "I hadn't become who I was meant to be yet. But your words made me fight harder to get there." He nodded slowly, processing this. "That doesn't excuse what I said." "No," I agreed. "It doesn't." We sat in my office as afternoon light filtered through the windows. The same building where he'd spent decades building his empire now housed my vision for the future. "Can I tell you something, Sabrina?" Dad asked. I nodded. "When you left that Thanksgiving, your mother cried for weeks. She begged me to find you to apologize." He paused. I refused. "Said you needed to learn the hard way." "Why?" I asked. He shook his head. "Pride. Stubbornness. Fear that maybe I was wrong." He looked directly at me. "I am proud of you, Riley. Of what you built. I just wish I'd said it 10 years ago instead of now." I felt tears threatening again but didn't fight them this time. "Me too." He stood slowly like an old man, though he wasn't quite 60 yet. At the door he turned back. "Thank you," he said, "for saving my company even after what I did." After he left, I sat alone in the office that used to be his. The circle had closed. I'd proven everything I needed to prove. But the real victory wasn't the company or the money. It was this moment. The moment we both finally understood what had been lost and what might still be rebuilt. The sun set over the city, and I thought about that scared 22-year-old driving away from Thanksgiving dinner. If I could tell her anything, it would be this: your father's words don't define your worth. Your work will speak louder than his doubts ever could. And someday, 10 years from now, you'll sit in his office as the person who saved everything he built. Not for revenge, but because you became someone who saves things instead of destroying them. That's the real victory. Not proving him wrong but proving yourself right.